Thanks very much indeed. Margaret, I'm reminded the other day I met a man in the street, I hope he's not in the audience, who is the proud owner of a battered typewriter, which was owned by Winifred Carney in the GPO in 1916, on which he hammered out James Connolly's last messages. And we're reminded also, of course, that Winifred Carney, a socialist woman from a nationalist background, from Carlisle Circus actually, was later to marry George MacBride, a former UVF man who had come through the Somme and the Great War. Our final speaker this evening is Dr. Rosemary Cullen-Owens. Dr. Cullen-Owens lectures on 19th and 20th century women's history in the Women's Studies Department of the School of Social Justice at University College Dublin. Her publications include Smashing Times, A History of the Irish Suffrage Movement, 1889 to 1922, and The Life of Louis Bennett. Can I ask you to show your appreciation for Dr. Cullen-Owens, who's going to speak on the Irish women's suffrage movement in this period?
There is going to be a little bit of duplication between both of the previous speakers you've heard, but it's unavoidable, but I'll try and keep it to a minimum. Isabella Todd you've already seen, and thanks to, that's Gentile Revolutionaries, the autobiography of both Anna and Thomas Haslam, who were both mentioned earlier on as key to the late 19th century women's movement and to the educational rights, obtaining educational rights for women. So despite the achievements of the women like these, and Thomas Haslam was key to it as well, by the turn of the century, women were still governed by laws made by men alone. Early activists had sought a political voice for women also, both at local and parliamentary level. And to this end, Isabella formed the first suffrage society in Ireland in 1871, the Belfast Northern Ireland Society for Women's Suffrage. And 5 years later, Anna and Thomas formed the Dublin Women's Suffrage Society, which underwent a number of changes in name as things changed. So I'm just going to refer to it as the Haslam organisation, because a lot of women's organisations have these long convoluted titles, and I'd be here half the night just giving the titles. So thanks to their efforts, by the turn of the century, women got poor law guardianship, and they got the local government vote, and now they set their eyes on the parliamentary vote. So in the opening years of the new century, we see a new phase of the women's movement occurring. Hannah Sheehy Skeffington and Margaret Cousins and other friends of hers who formed the first new suffrage society in Dublin in 1908, called the Irish Women's Franchise League. Thank you, Margaret. They represented a new era of educated Irish women, confident and articulate. Many of them held third-level degrees, having benefited from the work of their predecessors. They were very much women of the new 20th century, aware of contemporary women's campaigns worldwide. Key reasons for their forming a new franchise society included impatience with the conservative methods of the long-established Haslam organisation, who held drawing room meetings, and they were beyond drawing room meetings, admiration of the militant tactics of the Pankhurst organisation formed in Manchester in 1903, and also a conviction of the need for an independent Irish suffrage society distinctly separate from English connection. From the outset, it declared itself to be a militant and non-party organisation. It aimed to obtain the vote for women on the same terms as men then had it or might get it in the future. Its membership was restricted to women, but many men were active as associates. It worked to have a Votes for Women clause included in the Home Rule Bill then under consideration. And describing the early years of the League, Hannah related in her memoirs, we formed a committee, had colours, orange and green, a Votes for Women badge, held parades and processions, took our stand on soapboxes in various outdoor venues like the Phoenix Park, meeting heckling on their own ground, being good-humoured and capable of keeping their temper, providing women speakers who could keep their temper under bombardment of rotten eggs, overripe tomatoes, bags of flour and stinking chemicals. This was in the early days of the movement when this was good-humoured response. And interestingly enough, in the last couple of weeks, I came across an article on Lord Pirrie, but all the talk about the Titanic. I was reading through History Ireland and I came across an article on Lord Pirrie. I don't know if any of you have read it or not. And at a stage in his, between 1912 and up to 1914 or 15, he supported Home Rule. And he spoke to a meeting in Belfast, attended by most of his workforce, who bombarded him with rotten eggs, overripe tomatoes, and bags of... So I thought, interesting. Over the next few years, a number of smaller suffrage societies were formed, which were both militant and non-militant, and they generally catered for particular regional, religious, or political groups. And to coordinate the work of these groups, Louis Bennett... This is a very, very young picture of Louis Bennett. It's before her involvement. It's taken from a family group. Louis Bennett and a friend of hers, Helen Chenevix, set up the Irish Women's Suffrage Federation in Dublin in 1911. A number of Ulster suffrage societies formed a separate Northern Committee, which was affiliated to the Federation. The Federation subsequently formed two new societies, a Reform League in Dublin and the Belfast Women's Suffrage Society. By 1913, 15 groups were affiliated to the Federation, rising to 24 by 1916. Both the Franchise League and the Suffrage Federation established London committees to keep pressure on parliamentarians and to follow developments of interest to Irish women. As a result of this growth in suffrage societies, activists of the time would no doubt have agreed with Margaret Cousins that the era of dumb, self-effacing woman was over. And I've just given you there a list of the main suffrage societies. The Irish Women's Suffrage, that was the first one formed in 1876. The Haslam Organisation, the Irish Women's Suffrage Society, 1908. This was an evolution of the Isabella Todd Organisation, the Franchise League in 1908, and the Federation in 1911. Crucial to the dissemination of information on suffrage activities at home and abroad was the establishment in 1912 of the Irish Citizen. And you had a much better picture than I have of the Irish Citizen. Mine is quite meagre. I don't have it here just yet. Oh, sorry, I'll just go through this with you first of all. These are some smaller societies that were there. There was an Irish branch of the Conservative and Unionist Women's Suffrage Association formed in 1909. The Church League for Women's Suffrage, a Belfast branch in 12, and a Dublin branch in 1913. The Pankhurst set up branches here in Dublin and Belfast in 1913. And unusually, when most suffrage societies had ceased to exist, in 1915 in Dublin, Mary Hayden set up the Irish Catholic Women's Suffrage Association. So if you look at the Federation, which I spoke about earlier on, these are generally the leagues, the societies that were affiliated to the Federation in 1913. Now, it did increase as time went by. On the left, you can see mainly the ones who were in the southern part of the country, and here on the right you have the northern ones. But there would have been changes in this over the years. Now, I spoke about the Irish Citizen. This was circulated, I'm only giving you the masthead, I'm very mean. I just wanted to concentrate in on the motto, for men and women equally, the rights of citizenship, from men and women equally, the duties of citizenship. It was circulated, as I say, throughout the 32 counties and provided feminist activists with an important means of communication, education and propaganda. Frank Sheehy Skeffington and James Cousins were joint editors until Cousins and his wife emigrated in 1913. Thereafter, Frank continued to publish the paper weekly until he was killed in 1916, and it remained in publication until 1920 with Hannah and Louis Bennett, the main editors, during this period. It was designed to cater for all suffrage societies, militant and non-militant, making its debut at a peak time of cooperation between women's groups. And its pages reflected a diversity of opinion regarding methods and tactics, reflecting the vibrancy and commitment of women to their own cause. In addition to current national developments, its editorial and articles kept readers informed of broader aspects of feminism and the struggle for women's rights. Before militancy became serious, really serious, there was good-natured fun poked at suffragists. And by the way, just talking about the word suffragist, that was the original word used to describe women campaigning for the vote and was used in the late 19th century. But with the militancy, in 1906, the Daily Mail coined the phrase suffragette. That was used to describe the militant branch of the organisation. So this is a bit like what you had, a bit like your cartoon, must be the same women who were kind of standing with it. But this is a press caricature of suffragettes who have never been kissed. And even George Bernard Shaw, who actually supported women's suffrage and was in regular communication with the women. Irish Ferries seemed to, the Dublin Port got in on this a couple of years back. I came across it in a paper. And they got in on this cartoon of his where he said, give women the vote and in 5 years there will be a crushing tax on bachelors. And they said, take your fair lady to sea and have her take you. So I don't quite know what way to read that part of it, but it was just interesting to get George Bernard Shaw and his quote there. Now we come to the issue of Home Rule, dominant in Irish and English politics during the years, would dog the path of women's suffrage in Ireland and hinder its progress at many stages. And the Irish Parliamentary Party, under the leadership of John Redmond, held the balance of power at Westminster from 1910, and Home Rule seemed assured. Redmond and Prime Minister Asquith were anti-female suffrage. Redmond told a Franchise League deputation that he would not support female suffrage either in the Home Rule Bill or after Home Rule was established. When the bill was introduced into the House of Commons in April 1912, not surprisingly, there was no reference to female suffrage, and Irish members were responsible for the defeat of a number of proposed amendments to the bill in relation to women. Redmond held a national convention in Dublin in 1914 to consider the bill, from which women were excluded. And in June, a mass meeting of women from all over the country was held to demand inclusion of women in the Home Rule Bill. And this is a poster they put out in the Irish Citizen. And you see there's people, it's not terribly clear, but it's the best I could get. The woman on the extreme right there is a Mrs. Chambers from Belfast, Geraldine Lennox from Limerick, and Hannah is there, and third in from the left. Among the many northern societies represented at this mass meeting was the Irish Women's Suffrage Society, the Belfast Women's Suffrage League, and suffrage societies from Lisbon, Armagh, Newry and Warrenpoint. I'm going to give you two quotes from northern women, which I think are worth using. Mrs. Chambers from the IWSS Belfast said that whatever may happen in Ireland, suffragists realise that under the Home Rule Bill as it at present stands, one half of the population will continue to be governed by the other. While Mrs. Cope from Armagh wrote from the purely unionist point of view that women of all political parties should now stand for a great principle that no democratic government can be considered complete which ignores not only a class but a whole sex. At the meeting, a resolution was adopted asking the government to amend the Home Rule Bill by adopting the local government register, which included women, as the basis for election. I've gone too far. Sorry. As a basis for election to the new Parliament. Copies of this were sent to all MPs and to each cabinet minister. They all ignored it. Now, there had been some militancy by women from Belfast and Dublin in London between 1910 and 1912, and they'd been arrested and sent to Holloway prison. But the summer of 1912 saw the first militancy on Irish soil in Dublin and in Belfast. In June 1912, 8 members of the Franchise League were arrested for breaking windows of government buildings in Dublin. They were sentenced and fined. All refused to pay fines or accept bail. 4 of the women served 2 months in prison. The other 4 served almost 5 of their 6 months. And later that summer, the IWSS in Belfast smashed windows in the GPO in Donegal Square. Asquith was due to visit Dublin in July 1912 in regard to the Home Rule Bill. He had said a few weeks earlier that he would consider it a calamity if any system of Irish self-government were brought in which excluded any section of Irish opinion and Irish interest. One wonders, where did he place the female half of the Irish people? For days before his visit, letters were published in the Dublin evening papers threatening suffragettes against any demonstrations. Most of these were just signed Home Ruler, but one quite explicit letter suggested that the police should use whips on the shoulders of these unsexed viragos, slender, springy, stinging riding whips. And newspaper editorials also warned against any suffrage demonstration against the Prime Minister. Now, Irish suffragettes did stage a number of quite minor, mild demonstrations during the visit. There were poster parades, where women were wearing those posters back and forth like they saw earlier on. They broke windows in a post office. A group of women went out in a small boat to where Asquith had his boat moored off Kingstown in Dunleary, and they spoke at him through a megaphone. And they planned to hold, the Franchise League planned to hold a public meeting at the same time of Asquith's meeting, which was going to be in Dublin's Theatre Royal with John Redmond. They planned to hold a public meeting on the opposite side of the Liffey simultaneously. And whatever chance there might have been of the visit and the demonstrations passing off without incident was unexpectedly shattered by the action of 3 English members of the Pankhurst group who had come to Dublin for the Asquith visit unknown to the Irish women. And these women caused 2 main incidents. One was they threw a hatchet into the open carriage in which Asquith and Redmond were travelling. It missed Asquith but slightly grazed Redmond's ear. The other incident was an arson attempt and an explosion in the venue for the meeting. The women were arrested and a search of their lodgings revealed explosives. Again, the newspapers go overboard. The virago and the hatchet, dastardly outrage and reign of terror. Both the Franchise League and the non-militant suffrage societies immediately deny all knowledge of the English women in Dublin. Now, the immediate effect of these incidents was that for a time, all suffrage meetings became the subject of mob violence. The open-air meeting planned by the Franchise League to coincide with the Asquith meeting was attended by a large hostile crowd, many of whom had been cheering Asquith. And in the Irish Times today, there's a section dealing with 1912 and the Home Rule Bill, and there's pictures of the massive crowds cheering on Asquith. And this was the crowd, part of this crowd went over and started to abuse the women. The crowd became so aggressive that police had to form a barrier between the platform and the crowd, ultimately advising women to abandon the meeting. About 50 policemen escorted the women to O'Connell Street, being forced to draw batons a number of times. The women finally managed to board a tram, leaving with the police escort amid breaking glass as the crowd broke its windows. The Irish Independent reported every woman respectably dressed went in danger of being singled out as a suffragette, and a state of panic prevailed. And I think it was already mentioned that women were hunted like rats, so we won't go into that. Most of the Dublin, and for about 2 weeks thereafter, all society meetings were attended by hooliganism, as the Irish Citizen called it. Most Dublin papers denounced such conduct, and even one of the women's strongest critics, D.P. Moran, who editor of The Leader, defended their right to free speech, as he said, however eccentric they may be. At this time, when the Franchise League popularity was at its lowest, James Connolly showed his support by travelling down from Belfast, as Margaret said, to speak at one of their meetings, which was an action long and greatly appreciated by the women. And members of his union often protected suffragettes at their meetings. Ultimately, pressure of public opinion, allied to police activity and arrest, brought an end to the spate of violence. The trial of the English women, Mary Lee and Gladys Evans and Lizzie Baker, took place in August. Both were the first 2 were sentenced to 5 years penal servitude. The third, Lizzie Baker, got 7 months hard labour. All sought and were refused political status. In response, they went on hunger strike. They were joined in solidarity by Irish prisoners in Mountjoy. The Irish women were not forcibly fed, remained on hunger strike for the remaining 5 days of their sentence. Mary Lee, however, was forcibly fed for 46 days, Gladys Evans for 58 days. Forcible feeding had been used widely in England to deal with the large number of suffragette prisoners there on hunger strike. Its introduction to Ireland for the first time met with much public disapproval, as seen in the volume of letters and petitions pouring into the Chief Secretary's office. That's a picture of the process of forcible feeding, the woman being held down and the tube being forced down through her nose and down into her stomach that way. And sometimes the women cooperated and sometimes they didn't, and they regurgitated the whole lot. That's another cartoon. Another one there about the relationship between suffragists and Irish nationalists. He's depicted there as the angel of freedom, no woman, and he sees a copy of the Irish Citizen on the base there. I'm just wondering, have I missed out on one there? Yeah, I did. I knew I missed out on one. Between 1912 and June 1912 and 1914, there were 35 convictions of women for suffrage militancy in Ireland. 22 of these took place in Dublin, 13 took place in Belfast and Lisburn. Only the English prisoners were forcibly fed. And then we have, as I say, the cartoon from the Leprechaun. not very favourably disposed towards the women, and that's the Angel of Freedom. And this is where Meg Connery there, with a poster advertising the Irish Citizen, she tries to give a leaflet of some sort to Bonar Law and Carson, and you can see the policeman trying to get in and get it from her, but she gets across a certain amount. She certainly gets a good photo opportunity. Now, Diane Urquhart has pointed out that between 1912 and 14, relations between suffragists north and south were cordial. Speakers visited sister societies north and south, and they coordinated demands to include suffrage amendments to the Third Home Rule Bill. And the pages of the Irish Citizen bear this out. But she argues that solidarity amongst the women was always fragile. I would say that given the critical political manoeuvres leading to the passing of the Home Rule Bill, such fragility is not surprising. Hannah summed it up in her memoirs when she wrote that in Belfast our movement was regarded as tainted with nationalism, while in the South we were held to be opposed to Home Rule and to be anti-nationalist. The Irish Citizen argued that official unionism was as blind as official nationalism with regard to the women's question, and criticised equally nationalist and unionist women who choose to put party before women's suffrage. 1913, I think I mentioned it briefly earlier on, but the Pankhurst organisation set up a branch in both Ulster and Belfast, but primarily their main concern was Ulster. They wanted to target Edward Carson. They sought a meeting with him. Eventually he got one. He said that he couldn't agree to any promises and tie the party into anything. And they set upon a very, very stringent and very difficult type of militancy that hadn't been seen before. Up to this point in time, any militancy that had occurred in Ireland had just been token against government property, government offices. But they targeted private property and mansions. They set fire and burnt out a unionist mansion, and they also private houses belonging to some of the people involved in the Unionist Party, and golf courses and things like that. Other significant events to impinge on the women's movement during the turbulent decade from 1912 include the 1913 labour strike and lockout, with the developing relationship from that time between suffragettes and the labour movement, and the outbreak of war. I'll just give you one quote from James Connolly, saying that it was because women workers had no vote that they had not the safe, well, you can see it there yourself. They had women working for wages than which a man could not keep a dog. And there was also the outbreak of war in 1914, with stark differences emerging between those of a unionist persuasion. Sorry? Did somebody want to say that for longer? Okay, sorry. Stark differences emerging between those of a unionist persuasion and pacifists such as Frank Sheehy Skeffington and Louis Bennett, and that again placed strain on suffragist unity. The growing militaristic atmosphere north and south from 1914 was almost a factor, as was the changing nature of the relationship between suffragists and nationalists pre- and post-1916. This, to a large extent, was underneath, at the core of, if you leave the Home Rule movement to one side for the moment, politicians in Great Britain and they always wondered. They were a bit nervous about if women this was a completely new electorate. No woman had ever had the vote. So what party were they going to vote for? Now, this is obviously done up as a backlog to the women, the militant women with the hatchet and the fire and the brimstone in the background. But the point is, when she gets it, what will she do with it? I'll come back to that in a moment. In 1918, the parliamentary vote was granted to women over 30 years of age with certain property qualifications. It was also at the same time given to men of 21. To avoid an immediate female majority. In the general election of that year, as Margaret has said, Markievicz became the first female MP elected. From 1922, the political and constitutional status of women within the new Irish state appeared to meet all feminist demands of the previous decades. It had adult suffrage had been included in the provisions of the 1916 proclamation. It was also included in the Irish Free State Constitution of 1922, and all citizens of 21 now had the parliamentary vote with no property qualification needed. Where am I now? Sorry. Yeah, so the new state appeared to meet all feminist demands of the previous decades. Equal suffrage at age 22, and these principles were drawn from the 1916 proclamation and had been strengthened by the active role of women in nationalist life. But were women in political power after 1916 or from 1916? I'm going to show you a couple of quotes before I finish off with my text here. One of them is a quote from 1913. It's a priest, Margaret Cousins, was addressing an after-mass meeting, and her husband was standing beside this priest, and obviously the priest didn't know who he was, and he made this comment that it's a sure sign of the coming breakup of the planet when women come to take to leaving their homes and coming out in public. The other one is the title of my paper tonight by John Dillon to a suffrage deputation in 1912. Women's suffrage will be the ruin of our Western civilization. It will destroy the home, challenging the leadership of man laid down by God. It may come in your time, I hope not in mine. Unfortunately, he did, and he lost his seat. This is what I want to say. Were women in political power? I think this is a gorgeous quote. It's one of my favourites. And it's a quote from P.S. O'Hegarty in 1924, and he's criticising the militaristic attitude of Cumann na mBan. And you can read it there to yourselves. I'm not going to go through it all with you. I'm just going to concentrate on the last sentence. We know that with women in political power, there would be no more peace. And I'm going to ask you, were women in political power? Early hopes that women would play a significant role in this new Ireland were soon squashed as a series of restrictive anti-women measures were introduced by governments over the next 15 years. A number of factors, I would maintain, contributed to this development. The strong anti-treaty stance of many nationalist women, the lack of a cohesive women's movement post-suffrage. That happened in a lot of countries, that once the unity of the campaign for the suffrage was gone, it dissipated the women's movement. And above all, the development of an authoritarian society with traditional views regarding women. Bitter post-Civil War political differences accentuated the problem. In the North and the UK generally, where women had been heavily involved in filling men's jobs during the war, post-1918 government's main desire was to return to pre-war normality, with women being displaced from men's jobs and maternalism, pronatalism and domesticity becoming prominent interwar themes. And this was the pattern that prevailed throughout Europe. Rereading Urquhart's observation on the failure of the vote to attain equality by purely legislative means, I remembered this quote from Margaret Connery, which she published in the Irish Citizen in 1919. And this is my final comment. And she wrote, "Women have very little to hope for from political revolutions. Social revolutions offer an opportunity for reforms which go nearer to the heart of things and affect the lives of women more closely than mere political revolutions." Thank you.